Last week we talked about Batman and whether or not he should be considered a hero or superhero, and we talked about Luke Cage and his alter ego, Power Man. You guys had a ton of stuff to say, so let's get right to it. So the very first thing that I think we should address is what a ton of you guys had commented on the Batman video about whether he should be considered a hero or an actual full-fledged superhero. And that is that a bunch of you guys said, no powers, no super, Batman's not a superhero. And to that, I almost wonder if you watched like the entire video or just the first half of it. Because the second half, I specifically started by saying, all right, cool, assuming that he doesn't have powers, can he still be a superhero? And then we talked about a bunch of other stuff not related to superpowers, which I was more interested in hearing your thoughts about than the whole superpower thing. But, I mean, this was kind of expected. But I do want to offer a rebuttal here because a lot of you guys were saying things like anything Batman could do could theoretically be done by a normal human. And to that, I want to wholeheartedly disagree. But before I jump into why I think that way, I want to just knock something else off the table right now and say that I am not a Batman fanboy. I'm not the kind of person that just ends every argument with because he's Batman. I simply want to point out that I do think Batman is at least a little bit superhuman. So there was an article written not too long ago that dove into what would happen if Batman existed in real life and how long he could be Batman effectively. And in that article, it talked about a bunch of stuff like how long his training would be. It was somewhere between like 12 and 18 years to acquire all the training to become Batman. But the most interesting part came at the very end of the article where they said, you know, effectively, Batman could only be Batman in our world for 3 years before his body gave out. And that 3-year term was based off of things like comparing him to other athletes and just, you know, taking in the sheer punishment that Batman would have to endure every single day and the lack of sleep that he'd be getting and all of that, all those factors combined, about 3 years. But we know that in the comics, it has been pointed out that Batman could actually be Batman for 27 years, effectively. That's how long he could be Batman and effectively fight crime. So that is 9 times longer than any human could. And that's not any normal human. That is the peak level of human. That is if Batman existed in our universe. 3 years compared to the comic book 27 years. That to me is superhuman. At least it's superhuman compared to us humans that exist in our world. And that's something that the comments also started talking about was it's all about perspective. Benjamin Abruzzo brought this up in a really great comment about, yeah, I mean, Superman is only superhuman because you're comparing him to us humans, but compared to other Kryptonians, you know, he's just like a Kryptonian. Or compared to, you know, other heroes are just normal versions of themselves that just so happen to be better than normal humans. The direct quote here I want to read it is, so why call him a superhero when what he does is natural to his people under the yellow sun? He goes on to say, you know, same with Martian Manhunter and Aquaman, all of those characters and more are just doing what is natural to them, but it's just because we're comparing them from the perspective of us humans that's what makes them super. And when we're talking about perspectives, that same argument can be applied not just to the super part of superhero, but to the hero part as well. Take Poison Ivy, for example. When I was sitting down with Dr. Rosenberg and we were having our discussion, she brought up this interesting case of Poison Ivy. Now, Poison Ivy we might instantly recognize to be a Batman villain, but to her, from her perspective, she is not a villain. She is a hero by saving the plants, saving the earth from what us humans are doing to destroy it. So is Poison Ivy a superhero? Well, I think we would all say that she's super, sure, but hero, again, depends on our perspective. And so, of course, back to us being narcissistic humans, we take everything from the human perspective and we see her as being a villain when from a completely different perspective, from her own perspective, from the perspective of plant life, she is the biggest and greatest hero they have ever seen. With the exception of maybe Swamp Thing would also fit in there. Just other plant heroes in general. Same thing can be applied to Lex Luthor, who thinks that he's just trying to save the world from the threat that is Superman. You get the idea. Both the super and the hero part of superhero is all based off of perspective. And of course, the perspective we tend to take is that of our own. And this is actually a topic that we talked about in greater detail on our podcast that came out today, actually, further discussing this idea of Batman being a superhero. And yeah, we talk about perspectives a lot because it seems almost narcissistic of us humans to want to compare everyone to us to decide whether they are super or not. Which is why, as Silvershire points out, perhaps there should be a distinction between superhero and superhuman. They talk about how Superman, to continue using that example, isn't actually, or at least shouldn't actually be considered superhuman because he's not human. He's Kryptonian, so we should be judging him off of a Kryptonian scale, not a human scale. Also going on to talk about how different animals in the world are better at things than we are, but we don't necessarily call them superhuman. And this almost makes me feel like the term superhero and superhuman should be different terms and should be used differently, because superhuman might mean you're capable of doing something that humans can't, going above and beyond what humans can do, whereas superhero should simply mean going above and beyond what a hero can do, right? So Batman, who occasionally saves the world from, say, alien threats, could be doing something above and beyond what a normal hero, like a firefighter, would do, which would make him a superhero. Perhaps not superhuman, sure, but superhero, yes. And I think my favorite argument that Silvershire brings up, which might sway my argument from earlier about how Batman does have superpowers, is that he's still human, so even if he's able to do something that is far superior to what other humans could do, so for example, operating as Batman for 27 years when in real life it would be 3 years, that's not being superhuman, that's just setting a new limit for what is humanly possible. And honestly, I think that's probably the best argument I've heard for, Batman not having superpowers. But again, I don't think that not having superpowers means you're not a superhero, I just think it means you're not superhuman. We're getting into semantics now, I know. Its comment section is going to be great. But Silvershire, thank you so much for this insightful comment. I'm going to give you this week's NerdSync No Prize. Congratulations. It means absolutely nothing, but you get it. One last comment about Batman before we move on to the Luke Cage video. A lot of you guys in the comments wanted to make a distinction between superhero and vigilante, I guess saying that vigilante is basically like a non-powered superhero. I don't really see that distinction so much because I think a superhero, even with superpowers, could be, and usually is, still a vigilante. They're not mutually exclusive terms. They're kind of overlapping in that sense. If some Spider-Man acts outside of the law all the time, he's still a vigilante and he does have superpowers. So I don't know. I don't see that as, Batman is a vigilante and not, which makes him not a superhero. He can be both. Moving right along to our Luke Cage video that we were finally able to put out for the Netflix show. The #1 comment by far from people like Ian Fleury, Potato Pug, and so many others was that Luke Cage is technically already an alter ego because of his, real name was Carl Lucas. And so instead of me responding to this, I'm gonna go ahead and let the episode's writer, Angela, respond to this.
So as I was writing this script, I had very similar questions to what you guys are asking in the comments. Is Carl Lucas technically Luke's real name, and is Luke then necessarily an alter ego? And I found that I had to ask a question beyond just that one, and that is, what purpose does an alter ego serve in the realm of comics? And I found that it's not just about taking on a different name, it's about being able to swap back and forth between the names depending on what you decide to do. And the way I figured, making a permanent change, like changing your name, is different than something that is used interchangeably. Luke Cage is what he goes by all the time, across the board, which is a pretty big difference considering other heroes like Matt Murdock in the same universe. He is Matt Murdock and he is Daredevil. The reason that a hero uses an alter ego is to allow themselves to live two separate lives. Their regular, civilian Joe Schmo life and their superhero life, where they're out saving people, doing all the cool stuff. This leads me to then consider Carl Lucas as more of a previous identity than a alternate one. If Luke had his way, it wouldn't exist at all anymore.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I personally don't know how I feel about Luke Cage being considered an alter ego, a pseudonym maybe, but like a code name in the sense of a superhero. I don't really buy it. But again, we're arguing semantics, which is, I feel, how every conversation ends with me. I would love to know your thoughts about all these topics in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for writing some amazing, amazing comments on all of our videos. We've got more Batman videos coming up for you this whole month as we continue Battober, the long Halloween. If you missed any of the videos that we talked about here, you can click on the left to watch the video about whether or not Batman is a superhero. Or you can click over to the right to see our video about Luke Cage and his alter ego, Power Man. Make sure you hit that big sexy subscribe button while you're here, and we will see you on Wednesday for another video. See ya.